Good afternoon, everybody. A full house. Yay! Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here, for getting in. I'm Margaret Mims from the Department of Learning and Interpretation here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. And today, we continue our series of lectures in celebration of the exhibition Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art. Today is the fourth of 5 lectures in the 43rd annual Ruth K. Shartle Lecture Series, an annual series of lectures funded through a generous grant from the Brown Foundation Incorporated here in Houston. The Shartle Lectures were established in 1975 by Alice Pratt Brown, who served 26 terms as a trustee of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. She established these lectures to honor the memory of her friend, Ruth K. Shartle. Ruth was a longtime museum benefactor, known for the joy with which she approached life, for her intellectual curiosity, and for the enthusiasm with which she championed creative accomplishments. Exactly the spirit I think we celebrate in the work of Vincent van Gogh. So let's give the Brown Foundation a big round of applause. A big thank you. Now, just a quick recap of our lectures. In our first lecture, Nienke Bakker, who's senior curator at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, who can really pronounce the word Van Gogh correctly in Dutch, which Margaret cannot. Nienke probed the various ways that Van Gogh's reputation as a pioneer of modern art was firmly established during the decade following his untimely death. Then in our second lecture, Gloria Groom from the Art Institute of Chicago talked about the exhibition that she organized at the Art Institute in 2016, which reunited the 3 versions that Van Gogh painted of the bedroom in his yellow house in Arles, and the many insights that having these paintings side by side revealed about the significance of the bedroom for Van Gogh is not only a place of refuge, but a nesting place, a creative chamber, and of course a physical reality. Then last Saturday, David Bomford, the organizing curator of the Van Gogh exhibition here at our museum, took a deep dive into Van Gogh's painting, The Rocks, a painting that is part of the John and Audrey Jones Beck collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art here at the Museum of Fine Arts, a painting that captures the wild, almost electric presence of the rocky terrain of Montmajour, a presence caused by the fierce and blustering winds that sweep through the region. Can we even imagine the physical struggle it was for Van Gogh to paint the rocks outdoors under those conditions? It was a brilliant lecture, and it was David's last lecture as a staff member here at our museum, since just a few days ago, he and his wife flew back to England and into retirement. My deepest thanks to all of you for last week giving David such a rousing send-off after his talk. I know he was truly moved, and I look forward to one day inviting him back to continue to talk to us about the marriage between his 2 specialties, art history and conservation science. Next Saturday, we conclude this series of lectures when Louis van Tilburg, who is senior researcher at the Van Gogh Museum, will talk about Van Gogh's fascination with 19th century Japanese woodblock prints and how they became a benchmark for his work. So please do join us next week. But this afternoon, we focus on the last 30 months of Van Gogh's life. In February 1888, he moved to the warm southern region of France called Provence, after having spent several thrilling years in Paris, where the lessons of Impressionism and the influence of Japanese woodblock prints had inspired him to replace his dark brown, earth-toned palette with a palette of unmediated, brilliant color. Over the next 30 months, until his death on July 29, 1890, Van Gogh experienced the most intensely creative and productive period of his life, producing some 200 paintings, including several versions of his blazing sunflowers and his explosive masterpiece, The Starry Night. To explore the key role Provence played in Van Gogh's life and his work, I'm more than delighted to welcome Dr. George Shackelford back to Houston as our speaker this afternoon. One of the most highly esteemed authorities in the world on French painting of the 19th century, Dr. Shackelford is Deputy Director of the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, a position he's held since January of 2012. Before joining the staff of the Kimball, Dr. Shackelford served as chair of the Department of the Art of Europe at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, a position he held from 1996 until 2011. Before that, serving as curator of European painting and sculpture for 11 years here at our own Museum of Fine Arts from 1984 to 1995. Dr. Shackelford has organized and co-organized a wide range of exhibitions on themes of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art, including the exhibitions Gogh Landscapes and A Gift to America, Masterpieces of European Painting from the Samuel H. Kress collection when he served as curator here at our museum. The exhibitions Monet in the 20th Century, Mary Cassatt, Modern Woman, Van Gogh, Face to Face, Impressionist Still Life, Gauguin Tahiti, and Degas in the Nude while he was at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And the exhibitions Faces of Impressionism, Portraits from the Musée d'Orsay, Gustave Caillebotte, The Painter's Eye, and Monet, The Early Years for the Kimball Art Museum. Now, the sequel to his exhibition, Monet, The Early Years, the exhibition Monet, The Late Years, is now on view at the De Young Museum in San Francisco and will open at the Kimball in June. So when you make those summer plans, be sure that the Kimball is on your list of must-see places. A widely published author, Dr. Shackelford has won numerous awards and fellowships. He's lectured in museums and universities throughout the United States and Europe, and he holds the very distinguished honor of being elected a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters by the Republic of France. Today, his topic is Starry Nights, Sunny Days, Van Gogh in Provence. So please give him a big welcome back to Houston.
Thank you so very much, Margaret, and thank you all so very much for coming to hear me talk a little bit this afternoon about Van Gogh in Provence. The exhibition in the Beck Building is a truly wonderful survey of the life of Vincent van Gogh. By the way, I find it saves on cleaning bills if you pronounce it Van Gogh instead of Van Gogh. You don't need to send your ties to the cleaners nearly so often. And so I'm delighted to be able to talk to you this afternoon about those months that Vincent spent in the south of France in a very fertile period between 1888 and 1890. Let me move to the first slide. This is one of the most famous of all his portraits, the one that you can see, sort of swirling as a GIF sometimes. It was painted during this time period, and it's in the collection of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And this beautiful self-portrait, which is in the exhibition here, is, I think, a great way for you to see Van Gogh face to face just before he moved to the south of France. Painted in Paris in those months when he lived there with his brother Theo between 86 and 88. I want to take you to the sunny landscapes and the starry nights of Provence. Here are two famous details from two famous paintings at MoMA. But first, to indicate to you a little bit about where Provence is, for those of you who don't know the landscape of France very well. On the left is a map of France with the capital of Paris and the little town of Auvers, about which you'll hear something later, indicated at the top. So the very, very northern part of France. And at the right is the same map blown up a bit so that you get a little bit more detail about the landscape of Provence and the Côte d'Azur, the French Riviera, off towards Nice at the far right, Marseille at the bottom center, and then to the west of Marseille, up the Rhone River, the towns of Arles and Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where Van Gogh was to spend the time, basically the 2 years between 1888 and 1890. So that gets you situated a little bit. But first, before we take you to Provence, I think you need to get a little bit of a refresher course on what happened to Vincent up until that time. And his months are bounded by the spring of 1888 and the spring of 1890. Here are two paintings from those months. The beginning of the exhibition upstairs shows you Van Gogh, who was, as Dina Woodward says in the exhibition catalog, not a natural at drawing. And he really had to teach himself how to draw by copying from the work of older masters, whether it was Millet on the left or Holbein as reproduced by another artist in a drawing manual that he studied basically to teach himself how to draw. He soon learned, however, how to master the human figure, landscape, the sort of city landscapes. This is him in The Hague in 1881. One of the most beautiful drawings in the exhibition, this fantastic drawing of a marshy bog with water lilies. And you can see how he has mastered in a very short period of time the pen and ink method of drawing, but also charcoal and black chalk. Here a drawing of Scene, the former prostitute who was his lover, and the girl who was her daughter. And then the studies of the old men. These were pensioners in an old folks' home who he managed to get to pose for him because they charged him nothing to do so. He would get them to put on a fisherman's hat, a sou'wester at the left there, or the top hat and sort of frock coat with which they were generally attired in the drawing at the right. These two are in the exhibition. Here are another two in the same sort of get-up, sou'wester and top hat. By the time he had learned to paint these, it was time, or to draw these, it was time for him to move away from Scene. They had a bit of a row, and to go and move back with his parents. His father was a pastor, and to move back in with them in the town of Nuenen, which is in the southern area of the Netherlands, in an area that was largely agricultural. And there Van Gogh sort of lived in a back appurtenance to the house. Here's the parson's rectory. Here's the old church tower, abandoned in the landscape. And he studied the figures who were either toiling in the fields, or there was also a good amount of weaving that went on in this area of the southern Netherlands. Here are two wonderful drawings of harvesters in the fields being one of the subjects that he most was drawn to from this point in around 1882 all the way to the end of his career. Here are two, a figure there gleaning in the fields there at the left, and a woman cleaning out pots at the right, these beautiful drawings in the exhibition upstairs. And there he was able to convince the men and women of the town to pose for him for portraits that he was trying to make. They were kind of study heads, not exactly proper portraits, but he would arrange for the model to sit for him, to let him paint directly from life, going straight to the model's face using oil paints. And these three studies in the show upstairs are the kinds of things that he would eventually develop into larger pictures. Like I said, there was a good bit of weaving that went on here, and he would sometimes do portraits or sort of work portraits of the weavers at their looms. There are a whole wonderful series of these. The painting you best know, which is reproduced on a panel in the exhibition upstairs, is this one, The Potato Eaters. And it is an amalgam of those portraits that he had made from individual characters, lumped together into an imagined, certainly observed, but then reconstructed from the imagination in his studio or in his private quarters, shall we say, of a family eating potatoes. These people aren't exactly dirt poor, but they're certainly not wealthy at all. And there you see, you can recognize the woman with a kerchief at center, stabbing into a potato as the figure at the center of the slide I showed you just a moment ago. Now, by the time he painted this, in about 1885, his brother Theo had joined the firm of Bousseau-Valadon, which was a derivative of a larger firm of Goupil, for whom Van Gogh had actually briefly worked in Paris and in London earlier in his life, before becoming a preacher and a sort of itinerant gospel reciter to miners in the Brabant. But Van Gogh's dedication to making art paralleled his brother's newfound career as an art dealer. And Van Gogh sent this painting to Theo, who was then living in Paris. And he said, I want you to see what I've been able to do here in Nuenen, because I think it's going to be astonishing for you and your friends in Paris when I come to join you to live there. Now, imagine that this painting is sent to Theo Van Gogh in Paris at the time that this is really all the rage in Paris. So he had a lot of learning to do, a steep learning curve, shall we say, between the potato eaters and Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party, which is roughly contemporaneous. Van Gogh had had absolutely no exposure to what was going on in France in the years of the 1870s and 1880s. He knew about things largely through reproductions. He had very much admired the work of Jean-Francois Millet, but he had never really seen anything except some pastels 10 years before. And he had this very imperfect notion of what was going on in the capital of art in the 19th century. And his colors were the colors of Rembrandt, brown, black, white, and gray, very much a sort of Dutch palette, an almost cliched Dutch palette. And so when he arrived in France, it was, I think, not a rude awakening, but a very joyful awakening to the possibility of color. And so in early 1886, he joined his brother in Paris, and his first treatments of the Parisian landscape were, in a way, I think, sort of searching for home in Paris. This is a drawing of windmills on the top of the hill of Montmartre. Nowadays, those of you who have been to Paris, to the top of Montmartre, would not be able to recognize this from that time, because Montmartre was basically a hilly countryside at the time that Van Gogh moved there, certainly the back part of Montmartre. And here he is drawing the sort of the new landscape in which he is, and here he is painting it as well, but very much from the point of view of, I think, a Dutchman yearning to see a bit of his own countryside in his newly found city. But he soon adapts very well to these kinds of windmills, and here we have him on essentially on the other side, on the Parisian side of the hill, looking down across all these fences onto the plain of Paris and the city of Paris below, from these places of entertainment that were one of the glories of the top of the hill of Montmartre, where the windmills were actually grinding grain and making things. They were there for a purpose, but they also were the centerpieces of pleasure gardens like the Moulin de la Galette and eventually the Moulin Rouge, names that are still, with the Moulin Rouge, still very much famous today. And so here he is finding his native land in the city of Paris, and then extending that view. Here he is in the apartment he shared with Theo on the Rue Lepic. If you walk down the Rue Lepic in Montmartre, you will see a little marble plaque on the wall saying, "Here lived Vincent van Gogh with his brother Theo." And from this apartment, you could look out in between two neighboring buildings and see across the landscape of Paris to Notre Dame in the distance. Here's one of the letters that he later wrote to Theo, and a drawing in the exhibition that many people believe actually might be a portrait of Theo. Theo's letters, the letters that Vincent writes to Theo and the letters that he writes to his sister Wilhelmina, are amongst the most valuable tools that we have as students of Van Gogh's work nowadays to understand what it was that he was trying to do. Oddly enough, the letters that he writes to Wilhelmina may even be more communicative, because he has to explain to her in greater and simpler detail what it is that he is about. She not being an adept in the world of art. But he writes to his brother. He writes not in Dutch, but in French, since they are living in France. And and Van Gogh, by the way, for all of the image that is cultivated for him now of a kind of a bumbly guy, could read French, English, German, Latin, and Greek, as well as Dutch. And he was really quite a smart man. And his letters are extraordinarily beautifully written. If you have a chance to buy even a collection of the abridged letters, I think you will enjoy reading them, because he is a beautiful letter writer. I put this in because one of the problems of learning about Van Gogh in Paris is that he was living with Theo, and so he didn't have to write letters to him. So we have to extrapolate a bit from the works of art themselves, imagine that, that we have to look hard at the artwork. So when you see a painting like this one in the exhibition at the left, you have to imagine that Van Gogh is here confronted with a new kind of painting, the new painting that's entirely novel to him, Impressionism, and that he may be seeing paintings like the still life by Monet that you see at the right, and making his best attempt to do something like Monet had been doing. And I think it goes without saying that Van Gogh was still learning how to do this. His technique was not up to the standard of Monet, who was a considerably older man and had been working at this for 25 years by the time Van Gogh starts painting in his manner. But he soon develops his own style and technique. And in this painting of Peonies and Roses, also in the exhibition, when you look closely at it, you can see that he is beginning to do something that Monet would not dare to do for another probably 30 years, which is to really, really apply paint with great depth and almost abandon. And here you can see him slathering on the wet, thick white paint with touches of red in it, occasional touches of yellow, and then almost sculpting into the wet paint to suggest the texture of the leaves and the petals of the rose flowers and the peonies lying beneath them. There's an old saying that all painting is actually relief sculpture, very low relief sculpture. And if you're in the exhibition upstairs and you start thinking about the surfaces of Van Gogh's paintings, you'll reward yourself by looking at how actually he makes paint stand up on the canvas rather than simply conforming to the surface of the canvas itself. And he's already beginning to do this by 1886, 87. This portrait, again, a very beautiful one, shows also some of the characteristic features of his face, namely that he had this wonderful red beard and piercing green eyes. And when you look into these eyes, you'll see that they're this very beautiful color of green, or at least he tells us he had green eyes. And you're going to see in a moment another picture from Chicago that adapts this same idea. And there's a whole group of these self-portraits. Van Gogh wanted to paint portraits. He had wanted to paint them when he was in Noonan with those peasants, and he was now yearning to paint more, but his primary model had to be himself, because he was really rather cautious or shy even about asking people to sit for him. So there is a wonderful group of these self-portraits. Here are two more, and in them he tries on different personalities. In the painting here in Houston, you see him with a gray suit with the lapels kind of trimmed, either bordered or perhaps darned even, with a kind of blue trimming. And he's wearing that same garment here on the left, and a gray felt hat. You'll see it come back. Another version of him was wearing a blue smock, a kind of workman's smock, which he used to denote, here I am, the working painter, and a straw hat, which would be appropriate for painting out in the landscape. So this is kind of the city Van Gogh and the country Van Gogh presented to us here, again, him sort of trying on personalities. And he went out to what was not quite the country, but was the near suburbs. And here in Asnières, a town just downriver from Paris, the Seine begins to curve mightily as it leaves the city, and it crosses back over itself, not crosses over itself, but crosses back on the same terrain many times. And so by simply cutting across, straight across, you could go over bridge after bridge and get to Asnières pretty quickly. And it was a place where, near the Restaurant de la Sirène, the restaurant of the Siren, he was a frequenter of this little part of Asnières, painting the buildings along there. Here's another view of the same establishment, seen from down on the riverbank, because the road that faced the Restaurant de la Sirène gave onto the river, and where you could see boaters, whether people who might have rented a boat casually to spend a summer afternoon, or perhaps this man, who I believe is fishing, though his fishing pole is only barely indicated here. This kind of painting put him very much in the realm of what the Impressionists were doing, and he's doing it rather deliberately, I think, to kind of ring all the changes on Impressionist art. And it's something that he does very, very quickly. It's a bit like Picasso, who in 1901 repainted in the matter of a year, or maybe even 6 months, all of the styles that he could have encountered in the 19th century. Suddenly just did every last one of them in sequence until he felt like he had sort of learned what modern French painting was. And that's a bit what Van Gogh does when he's in Paris, painting his version of a Renoir, attempting to do something very much in the manner of Seurat. And in fact, in a painting like this one, taking the sort of pointillist manner and making something of it that was completely his own. This beautiful undergrowth, sous-bois, as the French call it, beneath the woods. One of two such beautiful paintings in the exhibition here in Houston. Now, by the time he's painting this, you see he has really gotten really good. And he really knows what he's doing at this point. But he now wants to, I think, start to try doing something more. And one of the things that he is profoundly concerned by is color. And this is a preoccupation that is going to stay with him for the rest of his life. He's been listening to artists like Seurat talk about the science of color and the language of color and the rules of color, of the complements, red versus green, orange versus blue, purple versus yellow, these secondary and primary tones, which he then uses in juxtaposition with each other in order to make the other grow more vivid. So here, for instance, in the fundamentally blue background, he dots it with speckles of orange. In the green areas, he puts in speckles of red. His own face becomes a kind of landscape for the juxtaposition of red and green in his red beard and his green eyes. And he takes the same over to his, to his portrait of the Scottish art dealer Alexander Reed, who was a colleague of his brother Théo's in Paris. And here you see it even more clearly in this close-up from the portrait that's at the Art Institute of Chicago. And the color, many of the colors that he was buying came from this man, Père Tanguy, Father Tanguy, who was a dealer in colors and in canvases, and who would occasionally take paintings on credit, if you will, against the artist's bill. And here Van Gogh portrays him against a background of Japanese prints, somewhat fancifully enlarged. And we believe these prints may well be from the many dozens, even hundreds of Japanese prints that Van Gogh had become fascinated by and had begun to purchase in great numbers. And it was in painting versions, as in here on the left, of a painting of a print by Hokusai, that he showed in a sort of mimicking way his admiration for Japanese prints, which he then exhibited at the Café of the Tambourin, the Tambourine Cafe, where his probable lover, Agostina Salvatore, was the proprietress in this wonderful painting from the Van Gogh Museum in the exhibition here in Houston. And it's probably at this moment, and probably in the same place, that he is drawn by Toulouse-Lautrec, his friend. Now, it's in this atmosphere of Paris that Van Gogh begins to feel that perhaps he has had just a bit too much. And too much beer, too much whiskey, too much absinthe, too much tobacco, too much late night, and that he needs to, in a way, get hold of himself or else. And so he decides to leave the hustle and bustle of Montmartre. Here's the Place de Clichy with the streets going up towards Montmartre at the right and left, and to debark instead for the sleepy town of Arles on the Rhone River down in the south of France and in Provence. Now he goes to the south of France with the notion that he is going to find there an equivalent, a European equivalent for the simplicity of the world and of living in the world that he imagines the Japanese have. He's built up this notion of what Japan is like based on the prints that he's collected, and he thinks that when he goes to the south of France, when he leaves the urban area and when he achieves the countryside and meets country people, it's going to be like the Japan of his imagination. About the only way that it's really like Japan is that when he gets there, the trees are in bloom. And it's an early blooming, and indeed there's occasionally still snow on the ground when he arrives. And he is enchanted by the blossoms that he's finding in the orchards of Arles. And he paints, this one is one of the most important pictures that he paints from that moment, and which he inscribes at the bottom, "Souvenir of Mauve," Mauve being the name of Anton Mauve, a painter, some sort of distant relation of his. And in the exhibition here in Houston, there is a wonderful painting from the MFA's collection of cows in a meadow by Mauve, just to remind you of his connection back to the art establishment in the Netherlands. The Souvenir of Mauve was followed by other views of orchards. And here we find him being able really to let loose his style in early 1888 on painting the landscape around the town of Arles. And you see glimpses of Arles through the trees. There's the red tile roof and a smokestack. And he tries to find in the landscape around the city, around the town, little reminiscences of Japan. So this suspension bridge that he paints about 3 or 4 times is vaguely like a Japanese bridge in his imagination. The Tarascon diligence, this coach that would take you from Arles down to the town of Tarascon, is vaguely like a rickshaw in his imagination. And also the sort of asymmetrical composition, the bright, flat patches of color. All of this is stuff that he thinks he's lifting, or that he is lifting, and he thinks is making it look more like Japan. But I find the most beautiful of the works that he paints in the first months after his arrival in Arles are the landscapes around the town. Here's a field of poppies, this in the exhibition. And then he goes out into the countryside. This is a wonderful painting from the Van Gogh Museum of the harvest at Gogh, which is a town on the outskirts, where he goes in June to witness the harvest, to draw and paint this from an elevated site. Here's the drawing related to the painting. You can see him using the end of the reed pen a bit like Seurat might have done in a kind of dotted technique to render halftones. And painting variations of these with these two paintings perhaps meant to represent summer and autumn, a pair of pendants that would give him some idea of the seasons as the work was going to the recurring cycle of life. He talks to his friend about Émile Bernard as a flat countryside where there was nothing but infinity and eternity. The word infinity is one that you're going to hear him use again and again. He says, "I'm always reproaching myself for not having done any figures here yet. To be honest with you," he says, "I have no objection to the countryside since I grew up in it. I'm still enchanted by snatches of the past, have a hankering after the eternal, of which the sower that he painted and a sheaf of corn are the symbols. But when shall I ever get round to doing the starry sky, that picture which is always in my mind?" He has to continue to paint the landscape around Arles. Here's a beautiful picture from the Kroller-Müller Museum in the exhibition. And in its details, you get a sense of his growing accomplishment, his sense of mastery of how to paint, and in a way, how to draw also in paint, because as you can see, he's using contours very effectively in painting pictures like this, as well as broad swatches and rather graphic application of paint in these, in the sense of these sort of low visions of what I believe must be a shadowy vineyard. And then this beautiful September painting of the plowed field, the harvest over, the field being plowed under in preparation for the winter season. And in October, he paints the green vineyard. There's a green vineyard and a red vineyard. This is truly one of the most sculptural of all the paintings in the exhibition. If you can stand in front of it just to see how the paint lathers up in the foreground here, it's absolutely exquisite when you see it in reality. And then the almost untouched ground of the canvas below with very thinly applied leaves in this greasy, oily paint, very transparent and showing through. Just a beautiful picture from the Kroller-Müller Museum. Now he, at this point, says that he really has to make portraits. And he's perfecting the painting of landscape, and he's now in the Provençal landscape and thinking, I want to do not only the place, but the people who live in it. He says, I think there would be something to do here in portraits. Although the people are blankly ignorant of painting in general, they're much more artistic than in the north, in their own persons and in their manner of life. I've seen figures here quite as beautiful as those of Goya or Velázquez. They'll put a touch of pink on a black frock, or devise a garment of white, yellow, and pink, or else green and pink, or else blue and yellow, in which there is nothing to be altered from the artistic point of view. But first, before I dare start along this line, I want my nerves steadier, and also to be settled in so that I could have people in my studio. We find him here, the newly arrived person in town who before he wants to welcome people and interact with them before he leaves the landscape where he can be the solitary painter and come into his home or a place where he can welcome a visitor. He must get his nerves steadier. He said that the Dutch have achieved the painting of humanity and of an entire republic by the simple means of making portraits. So, having done a portrait of La Mousme, this girl who he calls by that name, he turns to the postman Roulin, and he says, "I'm now at work with another model, a postman in a blue uniform trimmed with gold, a big bearded face very like Socrates, a violent Republican like Tanguy, a man more interesting than most. The change I'm going to try to make in my paintings is to do more figures. Altogether, it is the only thing in painting that excites me to the depths of my soul and which makes me feel the infinite more than anything else." Notice that word infinite again. He says to his brother Theo, "You are about to make the acquaintance," he's going to send it to him by mail, "you're about to make the acquaintance of Master Patience Escalier, a sort of man with a hoe, formerly cowherd of the Camargue, now gardener at a house in the Gogh," that's where the harvest was going on. "The color of this peasant portrait is not so black as in the Potato Eaters of Noonan." Not so black indeed, yeah. "But our highly civilized Parisian critics will be bothered by the same old problem," that is to say, the picture's crudity. He referred to its sun-steeped, sunburned quality, tanned and air-swept, which would show up all the more effectively beside all the face powder and elegance of a portrait by Toulouse-Lautrec. He also wrote, "I should like to paint the portrait of an artist friend, a man who dreams great dreams, but the picture is not yet finished. To finish it, I am now going to be the arbitrary colorist. Behind the head, instead of painting the ordinary wall of the room, I paint infinity, a plain background of the richest, intensest blue that I can contrive. And by this simple combination of the bright head against the rich blue background, I get a mysterious effect, like a star in the depths of an azure sky. Again, in the portrait of the peasant, I work this way, but in this case without wishing to produce the mysterious brightness of a pale star in the infinite." When we see these two paintings juxtaposed, we see, in fact, the starry night and the sunny day of his Provence as rendered in portraiture. And this is only one of many juxtapositions, and I'm going to insist on them throughout the talk, of his fascination both with the golden sunlight of Provence and the beauty of its nocturnal skies, the effects of night and of artificial light juxtaposed with that of natural light. In fact, it's in this painting that he achieves something about the sense of the artificial that he had never attempted before. It's called the Night Cafe. It's at the Yale University Art Gallery. And Van Gogh described it as, and I quote, "one of the ugliest I have done." It is the equivalent, although different, of the Potato Eaters. And just think of the chandelier in the Potato Eaters, the gas lamp down over the table, and here the lamps over the pool table and the drunken peasants in the right and in the distant background. I've tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. The room is blood red and dark yellow with a green billiard table in the middle. There are 4 citron yellow lamps with a glow of orange and green. Everywhere there is a clash and contrast of the most disparate reds and greens in the figures of the little sleeping hooligans, in the empty, dreary room in violet and blue. The blood red and the yellow green of the billiard table, for instance, contrast with the soft, tender Louis XV green of the counter on which there is a pink nosegay. That's just here, this counter and the pink nosegay. The white coat of the landlord, awake in a corner of that furnace, turns citron yellow or pale luminous green. I've tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. So I've tried to express, as it were, the powers of darkness in a low public house, an atmosphere like a devil's furnace of pale sulfur. He suspected that the critics would see it as the product of, and I quote him here, delirium tremens in full swing. And indeed, had they ever seen it, so they almost certainly would have interpreted it. Because this painting is, in fact, a deliberately radical, deliberately ugly, harsh, intense painting of what it's like indoors at night by artificial light. He turned himself then to another place. Oh, I'm sorry. This is thought to be, this painting in the exhibition is thought to be the portrait of Monsieur Ginoux, who was the proprietor of the Night Cafe. And you can see him committing a crime very easily, I think. But this wonderful painting of the Café Terrace on the Place du Forum is Van Gogh's first view of a starry night sky. He'd contemplated doing one of a plowed field at night and also planned a view of his house in the evening. But this one was the first that he began. And I will show you that, in fact, when you go to Arles, you can still go there. It's very much set up for you to be the tourist in the Van Gogh Cafe. I do not recommend the hotel at Wright. And then you can see this painting represented in this exhibition by the beautiful drawing after it that he made to send as a record of the painting to his brother. I was interrupted these days by my toiling on a new picture representing the outside of a night cafe. On the terrace, there are tiny figures of people drinking. An enormous yellow lantern sheds its light on the terrace, the house, and the sidewalk, and even causes a certain brightness on the pavement of the street, which takes a pinkish violet tone. I remind you that he's writing all of this because he can't, of course, send a color image of these. He's sending a black and white drawing, and he wants to convey to his brother what it is that the painting actually looks like. So the pavement of the street taking on a pinkish violet tone, the gable-top fronts of the houses in a street stretching away under a blue sky spangled with stars. They're violet blue or dark blue, and there is a green tree. Here you have a night picture without any black in it, done with nothing but beautiful blue and violet and green. And in these surroundings, the lighted square acquires a pale sulfur and greenish citron yellow color. It amuses me enormously to paint the night right on the spot. That is to say, at night, he's going and standing at this cafe and painting it right there. They used to draw and paint the picture in the daytime after the rough sketch, but I find satisfaction in painting things immediately. And this is what happens when he goes to paint on the side of the Rhone. And he sets up his canvas under a street light so that he can see just enough of the canvas itself to see what it is that he's putting down. But beyond the canvas is nothing but the river stretching around and curving into the distance and around to the right, with the lights of the quay reflecting in the water, and the Big Dipper shining beautifully in the starry sky. He calls this the starry sky actually painted at night under a gas jet. The sky is greenish blue, the water royal blue, the ground mauve. The town is blue and violet, the gas is yellow, and the reflections are russet gold down to greenish bronze. On the blue-green expanse of the sky, the Great Bear sparkles green and pink. Its discrete pallor contrasts with the harsh gold of the gas. Two colorful little figures of lovers in the foreground. And you can go and stand just there and see the river moving away into the distance, just as you would in Van Gogh's day. Around the corner, should you turn back around, you will end up on a place where once stood the yellow house. And he described to his brother a canvas representing the house and its surroundings in sulfur-colored sunshine under a sky of pure cobalt. The subject is frightfully difficult, but that is just why I want to conquer it. It's terrific, these houses yellow in the sun and the incomparable freshness of the blue, and everywhere the ground is yellow too. And there is this phenomenal picture in the Van Gogh Museum. And there is the place where it once stood. And these automobiles here are parked just where there was once the house, because this building is in fact this building. And it still stands, and the place where the yellow house was, it was destroyed, excuse me, I believe during the Second World War, and no longer exists. Sorry, you have different pollen in Houston than there is in Fort Worth. Those of you who might have seen Gloria's exhibition about, Van Gogh's bedrooms will have recognized that this little house was tiny, tiny, tiny. And it just consisted of the door here, the window, these two windows, these two, and these two. And that was the entire dwelling that he had at that point. He was complaining of his health, but wrote to Theo to say that, today I am at right again. My eyes are still tired, but then I had a new idea in my head, and here is a sketch of it. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to tell you that this house was situated on the edge of the road that went down towards the railway bridges. Now here's his bedroom. Here's the sketch of it. He's sending a little ink drawing. Simply my bedroom, only here color is to do everything. And giving its simplification a greater style to things, it is to be suggestive here of rest or sleep in general. In a word, looking at the picture ought to rest the brain, or rather the imagination. As Linda Nochlin once said, Van Gogh had an extremely imperfect idea of the effect that his canvases had on the modern viewer. Ought to rest the brain, or rather the imagination. The broad lines of the furniture, again, must express inviolable rest. Portraits on the walls, and a mirror, and a towel, and some clothes. The shadows and the cast shadows are suppressed. Excuse me. Talking is the worst thing for this. I'd hoped I was going to get through it without a pure attack. The shadows and the cast shadows are suppressed. It's painted in free, flat tints, like the Japanese prints. It's going to be a contrast to the night cafe. I'm not writing you a long letter because tomorrow very early I'm going to begin in the cool morning light so as to finish my canvas. He wrote to his sister to tell her that, oh, and by the way, I think the painting here is probably the Houston Rocks at Montmajour. Not sure about that. In November, mid-November 1888, he wrote to his sister to tell her that, quote, I have just finished a painting to put in my bedroom, a memory of the garden at Eton where they had lived. I know this is hardly what one might call a likeness, but for me it renders the poetic character and the style of the garden as I feel it. I don't know whether you can understand that one may make a poem only by arranging colors, in the same way that you can say comforting things in music. In a similar manner, the bizarre lines, purposely sketched and multiplied, meandering all through the picture, may fail to give the garden a vulgar resemblance, but may present it to our minds as seen in a dream, depicting its character and at the same time stranger than it is in reality. In a letter like this, he's responding very much to the kinds of innovations that his friend Paul Gauguin had been exploring from the years around 1887, where he was deliberately avoiding painting from life and from nature, and instead painting almost entirely from the imagination. Van Gogh was loath to do this, and it was only under sort of strong influence, urging and maybe even, you might call it extortion on the part of Gauguin, that he was able to paint in this way. And here is Gauguin's sermon, Vision After the Sermon, compared with Vincent's Memory of the Garden at Etten, and then Van Gogh's version of Gauguin's version of Van Gogh's painting made in Arles. They were unlikely, but historic friends. Van Gogh, the son of the preacher who became an artist, Gauguin, the son of the grandson rather of a notorious blue-stocking feminist who became a merchant marine, went around the world, eventually became a sort of stockbroker, and then gave up to paint, abandoning his family at the same time. And here in a pair of portraits, they exchanged with each other, Gauguin painting himself with the inscription Les Misérables, à l'ami Vincent P. Gauguin, so the miserables, as referring to Victor Hugo, to my friend Vincent, Paul Gauguin, 88, with the portrait of their mutual friend Émile Bernard in the upper right-hand corner, and then Van Gogh painting himself, as he described, as a Japanese monk, and it once had an inscription at the top. You can barely see little traces of it. This said, "Ah, mon ami Paul," I think it said, and all of this was attempted to be scrubbed away when Gauguin sold the painting, sold this love gift because he needed the money, and the painting was worth a great deal to him then. This painting now at the Harvard Art Museums on the left and at the Van Gogh Museum on the right, because Van Gogh never sold his. And it was with the intention that he should welcome Gauguin to Arles that Van Gogh set about decorating the little house and creating a kind of atmosphere for Gauguin, painting these imaginary portraits of himself in the sunshine on the left, and of Gauguin in the nighttime, in the sort of world of the dream and imagination on the right. His chair, Gauguin's chair, one in sunlight, one in artificial light, with a candle and a gas jet on the wall. And then they sat down to paint the same person. "I have an Arlésienne at last," he wrote in early November, "a figure slashed on in an hour. Background pale lemon, the face gray, the clothes black, deep black with perfectly raw Prussian blue. She is leaning on a green table and seated in an armchair of orange wood." This is Madame Ginoux, whose husband I showed you, the criminal, a moment ago. And she was indeed studied by the two of them in the same time that Van Gogh painted her portrait in oils at left. His friend Gauguin did this careful, very precise drawing, abstracted and stylized certainly, but a very carefully made drawing, each done in the same sitting over presumably the same hour of a pose. And it was then this drawing that that Gauguin would turn into his own image of the night cafe, that same place to commit a crime that Van Gogh had painted earlier. And it was Van Gogh's roughly slashed on painting at the left that he perfected into a picture. He would call one the sketch and the other the picture. So the esquisse at left, the tableau at right, the perfected version that is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the two of these represent two steps in a sequence of making this portrait of Madame Genoux. They also went on, Van Gogh rather, went on to paint a larger number of people, and particularly the other members of the Roulin family. He says, I have made portraits of the whole family, the postman whose head I'd done previously, the man, his wife, the baby, the little boy, the son of 16, all characters and all very French, though the first has the look of a Russian, that's the father. I hope to get on with this and be able to get more careful posing paid for by portraits. And if I manage to do this whole family better still, at least I shall have done something to my liking and something individual. The last in the series was probably Madame Roulin, who he had painted holding the baby before, but whom he now paints side by side with Gauguin in these two paintings. The first one on the left at the St. Louis Art Museum by Gauguin of Madame Roulin, and the other on the right at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston of Madame Roulin, and inscribed, it's barely visible over here, La Berceuse, or the Lullaby, or She Who Rocks the Cradle. These two works were done simultaneously, or at least begun simultaneously, and probably then worked on over the course of a period of time. But this is the moment when the friendship between Paul Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh reaches its breaking point. When at around Christmas time of 1888, Van Gogh experiences the first of many episodes of emotional breakdown. And in the famous argument that they have, Van Gogh is infuriated with Gauguin. Gauguin leaves the house. Van Gogh follows after him, returns to the little yellow house, and there mutilates his ear. We used to think that he just cut off a bit of it, but in point of fact, we now think he cut the whole thing off. Recent research has discovered a letter from the man who was his doctor that drew the part as received, and that was, if you will, was that. Gauguin leaves, goes back to Paris, leaving Vincent in the hospital, and there he is with his bandaged ear in January of 1889. This is a painting which is, of course, incredibly touching, that he should decide in painting a self-portrait to show himself very, very honestly with his ear fully visible, if you will, beneath the bandage, or the bandaged ear fully visible, revealing to us all what he has done, and that he has injured himself, a very frank kind of avowal of his emotional state. And I think it's therefore quite arch that I believe this painting by Gauguin is in a way, there is a relationship between the two of these, of Gauguin, who is painting himself, of course, as the haloed saint later on in 1889, nonetheless with the serpent of Adam there. Gauguin knew that he was a bad boy, if ever there was one, as the rest of his life would go on to prove, by the way. In March of 1889, Vincent would write to Theo, "As far as I can judge, I am not, properly speaking, a madman. You will see that the canvases I have done in the intervals between his breakdowns, are steady and not inferior to the others. I miss the work more than it tires me. And the great labor of the first months of 1889 was on the Berceuse series and on this amazing painting, the Boston one probably being, almost certainly being the very first of them, that he envisioned flanking with two of his beautiful paintings of sunflowers to create a kind of Madonna with a pair of brilliant torches on either side of her. This is a painting that he believed would offer consolation to the brokenhearted. As he said, whether I sing a lullaby in colors is something I leave to the critics. And again, I believe that he would have overestimated the calming effect of a painting of Madame Roulin. But he said, I made a fresh start today, and this is the end of January '89, so about a month after his incident. I made a fresh start today on my canvas of Madame Roulin, the one which, due to my accident, the hands had been left unfinished. As an arrangement of colors, the reds moving through to pure orange, building up again to the flesh tones, to the chromes, passing through the pinks and blending with the olive and malachite greens. As an impressionist arrangement of colors, I have never devised anything better. And from this first canvas, he proceeded to devise yet another, and at the end, 5 versions of this canvas, using a kind of tracing stencil to multiply them from canvas to canvas to canvas, and creating works that are wonderful in their complex differences, and I think we managed in the year 2000 to bring 3 of them together: the Boston one, the Chicago one, which is I believe in the middle, and the one at the far end from the Kroller-Müller Museum. One of them belongs to the Annenberg collection at the Met, so if they come together as 5, it'll have to be in New York because that collection can't lend. It would be nice to see whether, when brought together, they would indeed sing a lullaby or not. He described it as being like a chromolithograph from a cheap shop. A woman in green with orange hair shining out against a background of green with pink flowers. Now these discordant sharps of crude pink, crude orange, and crude green are softened by flats of red and green. I picture, as you saw a moment ago, these same canvases between those of the sunflowers, which would thus form torches or candelabras beside them. He rang the same changes on his portraits of her husband, and it's in the aftermath of painting these that, realizing he can no longer really comfortably live by himself and tend to himself, that with the help of the postman and his wife, having attempted to make great still lives like this one of oranges, and this wonderful one that says about health, de la santé, as you see. He was concerned for his health, and he committed himself voluntarily to the asylum at Saint-Rémy de Provence, a few miles away from Arles. And there in the asylum that was set up there, it was called it was indeed an asylum for the mad then. It still is an asylum nowadays. And it was in that environment that he would proceed to spend the next year. This is the garden at the left, and one of the interior corridors near the cloister on the right. And it's in the garden that he painted pictures like the famous irises from the Getty Museum. It's a very beautiful, it was and still is a very beautiful, peaceful place. You can visit it if you go to Saint-Rémy. And this gorgeous painting is of the garden there in the exhibition here at Houston. one of the most beautiful, lovely, um, um, just sort of flourishing images of flowers in his art. And there also the undergrowth, a kind of another return to that sous-bois effect that we had seen before. And from the window of his room, hospital room, a bit of a cell, but nonetheless, I mean, very much his own, he described this painting as the country that I see from the window of my bedroom. In the foreground, a field of wheat ruined and hurled to the ground by a storm. You can see it flattened out there. A boundary wall, and beyond the gray foliage of a few olive trees. Just there. Some huts in the hills. Then at the top of the canvas, a great white and gray cloud floating in the azure. It's a landscape of extreme simplicity in coloring, too, when the thing represented is, in point of character, absolutely in agreement and one with the manner of representing it. Isn't it just that which gives a work of art its quality? You can see that this is a painting not of a mad person. You can hear him writing about it. You see that he is absolutely in control of his language, and he knows exactly what it is he is doing. He's going to have episodes, but when he is painting, he is in complete control. Writing to his sister in mid-June, he described this canvas we had just finished and said it was a field of wheat turning yellow, surrounded by blackberry bushes and green shrubs. At the end of the field, there is a little house with a tall, somber cypress. You can see it at the center left, which stands out against the far-off hills and their violet-like and bluish tones, and against a sky the color of forget-me-nots with pink streaks, whose pure hues form a contrast with the scorched ears, which are already heavy and have the warm tones of a bread crust. God, he can write. And you see again that fascination with the sunshine and with the fields of wheat. Now, beyond that field, which he could also show in the rain, he was allowed to go and paint in the orchard nearby, very much under supervision. But immediately around the grounds of the asylum now are orchards of olive trees, as they were then and still are. At last, I have a landscape with olive trees, and also a new study of a starry sky, which is this. Certainly his most famous painting, maybe next to the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in the history of art. Painted entirely from memory, without recourse to the motif, as if seen from his bedroom window. He wrote, "This morning I saw the country from my window, a long time before sunrise, with nothing but the morning star." And he saw it as a stylistic abstraction in the Gauguin mode. "Though I've not seen either Gauguin's or Bernard's last canvases," he wrote, "I'm pretty well convinced that these two studies I've spoken of are parallel in feeling." When you look at these two studies for some time, it will perhaps give you some idea, better than words could, of the things that Gauguin and Bernard and I sometimes used to talk about and which we've thought about a good deal. It is not a return to the romantic or to religious ideas, no. Nevertheless, by color and a more spontaneous drawing than delusive precision, one could express the purer nature of a countryside compared with the suburbs and the cabarets of Paris. By a more spontaneous drawing than the delusive precision, you could express the purer nature of a countryside. Gauguin, Bernard, and I may stop at that point perhaps and not conquer, but neither shall we be conquered. Perhaps we exist neither for the one thing nor for the other, but to give consolation or to prepare the way for a painting that will give even greater consolation. He believed in the power of the landscape to convey emotion and to, in a sense, embody emotion, not only to convey it, but to actually be it. The latest one I've started is the wheat field, in which there is a little reaper and a big sun. That's at the left. The canvas is all yellow except for the wall and the background of violet-tinted hills. The canvas, which is almost the same in subject, is a very different in coloring. That's the one at the left, at the right rather, being grayish-green with a white and blue sky. I'm struggling with a canvas I started a few days before my illness. He's experiencing illnesses from time to time at this point. A reaper. The study is all yellow, extremely thickly painted, but the subject was beautiful and simple. For I see in this reaper a vague figure toiling away for all he's worth in the midst of the heat to finish his task. I see in him the image of death, in the sense that humanity might be the wheat he is reaping. So it is, if you like, the opposite of the sower, which I tried to do before. The sower, the reaper. But there's no sadness in this death. This one takes place in broad daylight, with the sun flooding everything with the light of pure gold. And in the various paintings of the olive orchards, we see that fascination with light, with daylight here, as a kind of maybe even dusk in the beautiful painting in the exhibition, or indeed in this wonderful painting in the Museum of Modern Art. And we see him contrasting his notion of how a painting can express religious sentiment with that of Gogh, who feels that he feels that Gogh is too literal, that Gogh has to show someone in the act of doing something, and that he can make the landscape be that emotion and have that emotion without peopling it with Christ in the Garden of Olives. So he goes on to believe in this emotive power of landscape. After a particularly violent episode, he woke up and was once again at near perfect form. And he began to paint 2 self-portraits. This one you'll remember from its being here in the National Gallery Impressionist show a few years ago. They say, he wrote, and I'm very willing to believe it, that it's difficult to know oneself, but it isn't easy to paint oneself either. So I'm working on 2 self-portraits at the moment for want of another model, because it's high time I did a little figure work. In the one I began the first day I got up, I was thin and deathly pale. It's dark purple-blue, the head whitish with yellow hair, thus a color effect. But I've since started another, 3/4 length on a light background. Suppose I get out of here one day, and here is the head of the asylum, who might not want to let him out completely. Suppose I get out of here one day, wouldn't it be far better if I came back definitely capable of doing a portrait with some character than if I came back as I started? That's clumsily put, for I'm well aware one cannot say, I know how to do a portrait, without telling a lie, because that is an infinite objective. Still, you will understand what I mean, that I must do better than before. And in the coming months, he continued to paint in this beautiful garden. Again, the picture at the Kroller-Müller Museum here in the exhibition, and another showing the cypress trees, the kind of bent and lightning-struck trees against the setting sun. And here, in spite of his experimentation with Gauguin's stylization, he didn't believe that making art that was wholly from the imagination or from literary sources was a good thing. He didn't believe in it. And writing to Bernard, he singled out the ways in which paintings of real things could convey the complex emotional and even religious sentiments that I mentioned to you a moment before. And he was particularly interested in this very painting. The edge of the garden, he said, is planted with large pines with red ochre trunks and branches, the green foliage darkened with a mixture of black. These tall trees stand out against a yellow evening sky, crossed with purple stripes, the yellow yielding to pink and green higher up. The nearest tree has an enormous trunk, but has been struck by lightning and sawn off. However, a branch still juts high up in the air and sends down a rain of dark green needles. This somber giant, with its hurt pride, contrasts, if you were to lend it human characteristics, with the pale smile of a last rose on the fading bush in front of it. Just here. Under the trees, empty stone benches, mournful little box trees, the sky is reflected yellow in a puddle after the rain. A ray of sun turns the dark ochre into orange with its last reflection. Small black figures wander about here and there among the tree trunks. Of course, you realize that the combination of red ochre, green darkened with gray, and the black stripes indicating the contours arouses that anguished feeling, the so-called black and reds, with which some of my fellow patients are afflicted. Moreover, the motif of the great tree struck by lightning, the wan pink-green smile of the last autumn flower, serve to reinforce this impression. And indeed, his landscapes are more and more filled with emotion. He talks about this one, and he writes about it and saying, I'm telling you about these canvases and about the first one in particular, that's this one, to remind you that one can express anguish without making direct references to the actual Gethsemane, and that there is no need to portray figures from the Sermon on the Mount in order to express a comforting and gentle motif. And as he describes nature, he imbues it again and again with human characteristics, giving to the trees the sense of personalities, given to the light the sense of comfort or anguish, and above all, giving to the sky of the starry night that extraordinary sense of the infinite that he had written about and talked about so much. In these images of the night, we see him, I think, searching for that sense of the infinite, harder to paint, harder to reach when painting at night than by day. And then he comes up with this last fantastic painting of a starry sky from Provence. I have a cypress with a star from Provence, he said, a last attempt, a night sky with a moon without radiance, the slender crescent barely emerging from the opaque shadow cast by the earth. One star with an exaggerated brilliance, if you like, a soft brilliance of pink and green in the ultramarine sky, across which some clouds are hurrying. Below, a road bordered with tall yellow canes. Behind these, the low Alps. An old inn with yellow lighted windows and a very tall cypress, very straight, very somber. On the road, a yellow cart with a white horse in harness and two late wayfarers. Very romantic, if you like, but also Provence, I think. In the spring, having painted this beautiful blooming olive branch as a birthday gift to his nephew, who had been christened in his name, the younger Vincent, he paints this as a present for the nursery of this young boy. And it closes the 2-year cycle of him living in Provence that he had begun in 1888. And he moves, having painted just a few more beautiful pictures of flowers, back up to the north of France and to Auvers, which is just about here, to the north and to the east of Paris. And he moves into an inn, a restaurant, the Auberge Ravoux, which had chambre meublée, furnished rooms. And he's there to be under the treatment of a Dr. Gachet, a man who he said to Théo seems just as crazy as you or me. But he nonetheless was there to receive this treatment from this doctor who was going to oversee his care and make sure that he didn't hurt himself above all. And he paints furiously in these last weeks of his life. About 6 weeks in Auvers, here are the houses, the church. And he said, and painting the people of the town as well, I like to think of these as night and day images. And then painting the beautiful landscapes in a series of paintings that are about double squares, about twice as wide as they are tall. And talking about Auvers, writing to Théo, he says, I still feel very sad and continue to feel the storm that threatens you, it's a financial storm really, weighing on me too. What was to be done? You see, I generally try to be fairly cheerful, but my life is also threatened at the very root, and my steps are also wavering. I feared, not altogether, but yet a little, that being a burden to you, you felt me to be rather a thing to be dreaded. But Joe's letter, that's his sister-in-law, Joe's letter proves to me clearly that you understand that for my part, I am as much in toil and trouble as you are. There, once back here, I set to work again, though the brush almost slipped from my fingers, but knowing exactly what I wanted, I have painted 3 more big canvases since. They are of vast fields of wheat under troubled skies, and I did not need to go out of my way to try to express sadness and extreme loneliness. I hope that you will see them soon, for I hope to bring them to you in Paris as soon as possible, since I almost think that these canvases will tell you what I cannot say in words, the health and restorative forces that I see in the country. I am, at least I feel, too old to retrace my steps or to desire anything different. That desire has left me. Now this painting, romantically fictionalized as Van Gogh's last painting, is almost certainly not. And we don't really know what the last one might be. But it's in these fields, against this beautiful harvest, the summer sunlight harvest of the wheat, that we see him coming to a kind of an attempted healing in the town of Auvers. Now, I was struck by the fact that the writing that he did about that summer sky, that Provence sky in Saint-Rémy, has no equivalent in Auvers, even though he writes it from Auvers. And I was in the exhibition yesterday, and I was looking very hard at this beautiful painting, which is in a private collection and which you have a very, very rare opportunity of seeing here in Houston. And I began to think about it, and I thought, this is about sunlight, but maybe it's also about the sky. And it occurred to me that it wasn't so far in color or in handling from the sky, the lonely sky of Provence, which he's writing about while he is in Arles. The letter I quoted to you describing it was not written at the moment of its creation, but nostalgically and retrospectively a few months later. And it seemed to me that this might be, in fact, a painting that was about starry nights and sunny days at once. And that this figure might, in fact, bring together in one picture the notions of the sunlit field and the poetic, starry infinite that he had explored in his portraits of Patience Escalier and Eugène Blanc. It's only an idea, but I think it's worth our thinking about as we think about day and night, starry nights and sunny days in the art of Vincent van Gogh. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. George Shackelford for truly gives new meaning to a richly illustrated lecture. That was fantastic. And we look forward to hopefully having all of you in the audience next week as we conclude our series. Thank you again. Enjoy the evening.